So welcome everyone and thank you for your patience. We're now all set to launch our webinar on Foresight and Alternative Futures and the UN Development Assistance Framework, the main strategic planning tool of the United Nations at country level. We have with us Katerina Tully as our primary speaker. Kat advises many different governments and public sector organizations around the world. Her specialisms are strategic foresight, managing risk, the impact of technology, democracy 2.0, and participatory forms of engagement. We at UNDOCO, my name, by the way, is Gina Lucarelli. Apologies for not introducing myself. I'm the team leader here for Knowledge and Innovation. We've been working with Kat on looking at our own strategic planning processes, both in terms of the guidelines and in practice, and seeing how this measures up to recent innovations in strategic planning, which are underway in different parts of the world and different institutions. So we've been really grateful to have Kat's expertise and her perspective during this process. So we will go through a presentation with Kat. We have a few polling questions. So once those come up, if you want to answer them, just write in the chat box your answers so we can get a bit of engagement from you as we go. We also have with us Ana Dautovic of the Resident Coordinator's Office in Montenegro on the line, where they have been using Foresight for the development of their strategic plan, their UN Development Assistance Framework. This past year, there are a couple of very good blogs on silofighters.org from the team in Montenegro, and so we'll hear from her a little bit later. So Kat, over to you, and we just let us know when we should change the slides.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much for that lovely introduction, Gina. Good afternoon and good morning and good evening, I guess, to you all across the world. I'd like to thank Gina and her team for putting this on, and very much thanks to you for attending and spending an hour of your Monday with us to explore this really interesting area of strategic foresight and planning. And it has been really exciting to be part of the journey within the UN and listening to what the country teams have been doing in order to effectively do what this is about, which is making better decisions today by exploring different futures. So the objectives of today, and I will ask you to go next to the next page with the 3 bullet points. The objectives of today is really to explore these 3 questions. How can foresight and other public sector innovations improve multi-year strategic planning? How can the UNDAF process make better use of foresight? And what can we do in 2016, this critical year, to experiment as the SDGs are integrated at the national level? So this is really an hour session to inspire you, and I look forward to kind of discussing with you individually on how to take this forward. I have much more material than a 30-minute presentation, so I will skim through some of it, and then we can return during some of the questions or afterwards. As Gina pointed out, there'll be some polling questions to get your insights and prompt your feedback and enable us to continue the conversation afterwards. But I guess the key message before I plunge into the presentation is really, it's a lot to absorb. I've tried to include a little bit for everybody. Some, I know, are already very au fait with these techniques, others are new. So I hope there's something in it for everyone. But if you do want to follow up, do, because this isn't a magic art at all, but there are common challenges to doing this effectively, and I've learned some of these painfully, so it's great to kind of share experiences. So if we can go on to the next slide, please. Here's a little bit about me and the experience that I have and who I've worked with, just so you can understand where my experience comes from. I'm mainly a practitioner and researcher and advisor in the area of governance. I've worked in the UK government in the Prime Minister's Strategy Unit and briefly in the UN and the World Bank. And now basically I work with governments and civil servants from around 60 countries across the world. And my interest is on future trends of governance in particular, and how we innovate to take into account these trends. So there are three areas that I'm particularly interested in, and I'll pick out some of the material that you see in front of you on that slide. I'm particularly interested in how we engage with profound and long-term issues and disruptions that we're facing in the here and the now, which really dwarfs anything that we've seen in terms of social media and governance. What happens, for example, when longevity, people start living to 150 years? I did a study on the bicentennial woman. What are some of the social implications of people living until they're 200? But there's things like blockchains, human rights and artificial intelligence, 3D printing and diseases that are all coming up on the agenda and have got profound impacts on governance and how we plan for the future. The potential to solving a lot of our problems as well as causing new ones. And I do that for the National Intelligence Council and various other organizations. But I think, and this is the second point, it's also really interesting to see what kind of leadership and cutting-edge approaches in public services and in international organizations we need to engage and prepare for this future. And so within that domain, I work with the UN on a panel around SDG 16, which is effective, accountable and inclusive institutions, as well as on the means of implementation, to work with particular countries saying, well, how do you innovate to have a new form of leadership? Then there's also really interesting, the third pieces of work that I do is around helping support and disseminate and think about cutting edge governance. What does next practice look like? And there we'll work with, for example, the excellent Centre for Global Public Policy in Singapore that the UNDP runs, doing this report, for example, on system stewardship and stewarding the future. Also working with very interesting networks of BRICS universities working on public administration. They're all thinking about how they integrate futures and thinking about the future into teaching a new generation of civil servants in India, for example, where that photo right at the top was taken. And then also working with regional bodies like ECLAC, CEPAL, who also themselves are thinking about how they support their nation states members to think about the future collectively, regionally, as well as at national level. So I hope this gives you an idea of some of the work that is going on and the interest that there is in foresight and making better decisions today for the future around the world. And it's based on this experience as well as 4 UN country team case studies and interviews with around 25 people that the paper and this presentation is based on. So if I can go on to the next slide. The next slide is really a summary of my argument, but please don't go to sleep after I speak to you about this slide. Please continue. There will be interesting things and perhaps surprises in the rest of the presentation. But what I wanted to do was to show you the outline of my hypothesis and argument and where this PowerPoint, where this presentation, this seminar, what we're going to be covering. Why foresight's important, the growing appetite for emergent strategic planning processes and what it looks like, and what we can do about it at the country team level. This is the journey that we're going to go through together. So first of all, what we'll do in the first third of this discussion is go through how the 2015 agenda both reflects and also has led to governance, innovation, and strategic planning. So the 17 SDGs and the open working group process basically is based on a complex adaptive systems approach to policy making. Post-2015 process has driven innovations in the theory and practice of strategic planning and foresight in different countries around the world that we can learn from. And now we're facing this challenge of taking the SDGs to the national level, and the UNDAF has a critical role to play as you, in your processes of designing the next UNDAF in your countries, are engaging with now. The second third of the seminar is basically looking and just noting at how the demand for these approaches is growing. We'll look at the 5 key aspects of a good emergent strategic planning process, and we'll just look at examples of this increased focus and demand across the world. And then finally, we'll talk about how we respond to that demand. How do we build the supply side, the capacity to respond? These approaches are easily integrated into the UNDAF process, and we will look at 3 case studies, examples within the UN of the use of Foresight, and I hope to hear from you about additional cases. And then we'll examine some of the key takeaways, perhaps, that you can take around tweaking the country analysis process, building visions and scenarios, perhaps an enhanced way of doing strategic prioritization and doing strategic navigation, monitoring and evaluating, looking forward as well as backwards. So that is the journey that we're going on together today. Is everything okay at this point? I'll just check that you're still listening to me and that my speed is going okay.
It's great from here. If you can go a little slower, that'd be good, because some people say they have trouble hearing. I'm not sure what the reason is, but it always helps if you speak a little bit slower.
Excellent. Okay, I will do that. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Well, Gina. Yeah. Okay. Excellent.
And colleagues in the who are listening online, if you have any difficulty hearing, just write us in the chat box, and we'll see what we can do.
Fantastic. So we are now on slide 5, and we'll be going through slides 5 and then 6, 7, and 8. So this first slide is from a very famous study that many of you will have heard of, which is the Limits to Growth exercise done in the early 70s by the Club of Rome. And this really, I think, summarizes very nicely where we are globally and why Foresight is so important. So this was the prediction. This was the actuals up until 1970 of where the world was going in terms of population resource use. And they forecast and showed very effectively, and this is slide 6, that if we didn't move from this business as usual trajectory, we were going to hit some very serious planetary boundaries and, in fact, effectively face permanent anthropomorphic destruction. Now, despite these visions and these issues being out there for the past 40 years, policymakers have not been able to respond and develop effective responses to it. So it's not easy at a global level or a national level, that's for sure. But what the SDGs are trying to get us to do is to live within the planetary and social boundaries that are represented on slide 7. So this is the SDG ambition, that we can actually live within the planetary boundaries. And if you go to slide 8, you'll see that some of them are already being exceeded already. So effectively what we're doing is we're trying to create an ability at policy-making level, at the international, national and local level, to engage with key issues that face us in the future. And what we've noticed is that policy-making approaches, decision-making approaches in the past 40 years have been unable to help us do that. So we need a different way of thinking and preparing for the future, and that is what strategic foresight helps you to do. So I think what's a very nice analogy by Janos Linsky, who is the advisor to the Open Working Group, Hungarian chair, he says that taking the process of bringing the SDGs to a national level is almost like defusing a ticking time bomb at the national level. It's going to look very different depending on what on the national context, but it is really important. We've only got a certain amount of time, and it's a complex process, and this is what we're trying to do. So how to do that? Let's think about the underlying principles behind the policy-making process normally and strategic planning processes when we're thinking about the future. If you can turn to slide 9, please don't necessarily read all the detail. What you'll see on the left-hand side is a graph that basically says that forecasting is highly predictable and useful when you're just looking out a short time. But the longer you look out, and that may be weeks, months, years, the less useful it is. The predictive ability goes down because forecasting is useful only over the short term. And then the utility of foresight goes up as you go look out into the future. And foresight here is defined as the capacity to think systematically about the future to inform decisions today. So in a world where there's a lot of disruption, and in a world in which we don't actually really know what's happening, and we're trying to plan for 2030, and we have technologies that really disrupt and mean that we're not operating in a linear environment, it's really important to use strategic foresight. You will see on slide 10 that here are some additional reasons why the strategic planning process has evolved. Whether it's Mintzberg, computer-aided insights design principles, or whether it's cognitive and behavioral insights from research that we've learned over the past 10 years, there are good reasons for actually changing the way that we do the strategic planning process from a linear approach to a much more systemic one. One reason is to help us understand and address behavioral and heuristics, to build systematic approaches to help us avoid these three traps that we tend to fall into when we're doing planning processes. One of them is being very internally focused. We often focus intently on internal organizational features and overlook the external environmental changes. Another heuristic behavioral pattern that we tend to fall into that reduces the quality of our strategic planning processes is premature convergence, i.e. quickly agreeing the shape of the futures and what we should do about it because of group dynamics, either because we in groups have a similar point of view very often, and often therefore similar blind spots, but also whether consciously or unconsciously we want to agree. And then thirdly is the cognitive response to high levels of volatility that we seem to be moving into a highly volatile environment over the past 10 years in particular, where we have paralysis through this uncertainty. We either decide that the future is too uncertain to make any plans for, or that it's just better to muddle through, or we assume that tomorrow will be like today. On the right-hand side of the slide, what you'll see is insights that come from the fact that we increasingly realize that the public policy issues and environment that we're working in is a complex systems one, not a linear one. And these have features around it that also mean that we need to change the way we do our strategic planning. That's non-linearity, so we have disruption. Modularity, it means we cannot predict what's going to happen, and therefore we need to probe and test. And that probing and testing often needs to be diffused and done by people networked at the periphery. So this is as far as it gets in terms of the kind of background to how strategic planning has changed over the past 2 decades, really. But basically what the new form of emergent strategic planning, which has built on these insights that we've got from cognitive science, from computer programming, from design approaches, etc., is that strategic foresight and emergent strategic planning is about building comfort with decision-making under conditions of uncertainty and creating organizations that are future alert. So that's what we're trying to do effectively. Next slide, page 11. So, what does this emergent strategic planning process look like? How is it different to what you may have been doing before? And I would argue that it's not rocket science, that it's things that very often we intuitively want to do, and we can integrate it relatively easily into the processes that we were wanting to do anyway. So here are 5 requirements that I suggest that you look out for in particular. So the first one is around the importance of examining the strategic context in a future-focused way rather than just looking historically, and to look at it in a systemic way, so to look at the interdependencies of what you're looking at, how gender, how demography interacts with economics and technology, for example. So this means that the country analysis phase, we would want to analyze trends and drivers of possible futures context. We'd want to challenge received wisdom, for example, assuming that trends will continue, and we'd want to look at interdependencies. And we'd like to do that working on what we call the building blocks of the future, which is the drivers of trends. So look at what are the political, economic, social, technological, legal, and environmental drivers of the future, and look out not just 1 year, but also 5 years and 15 years. These 3 horizons can be very, very useful when doing foresight exercises, because it can help surface insights that may be politically unsavory at the short term, but you can at least say it in the longer term. And it means that it can inform but not necessarily be captured by budget and operational planning decisions. So, you know, always look out further than the 5 years that you're doing your budgeting process for, basically. So that's point 1. Point 2 is the importance of an open engagement of a wide set of views. This should especially include vulnerable and extremely poor citizens, i.e. the key beneficiaries of policy design. And it's essential to examine the different trends and issues that you've included in your country plan analysis from different and multiple lenses. This point about getting different parts of your network, and especially your diffuse network, the people on the periphery, to give you insights is really critical, because they're the ones that pick up weak signals, and so you really need that for effective understanding, as well as developing a common knowledge and ownership of what the key issues are. And then I would say that these dialogues and relationships, almost a sensor network, if you like, would then form the basis of future scanning and adjustment of policies on an ongoing basis, as well as the basis for joint implementation and co-creation. The third step is then around identification of possible alternative futures and trends. So this includes trends that are desired as well as the undesirable ones. That's where you can kind of plan for contingencies, you know, worst case scenarios, all these terms that you can include them in your process here. And they can be highlighted either through complete scenarios, is what we call them, or snapshots. But it's very helpful to monitor those shocks and risks and opportunities and the assumptions behind what you're designing that you want in the future, your vision of the future. What's the assumptions, and can you use those assumptions then to monitor on your journey there? Fourth is around building on policy implications. So emergent strategic planning process is really, you review what genuine strategic alternatives might look like. You may seek out alternatives and then develop common resilient postures and assets and capabilities. What does this mean? This means that you're building resilience to the fact that your country may be going in a very different scenario, that the economic trends may go down as well as up, and that you actually have already thought through what some of the capacities are as a UN country team internally, but also what are some of the aspects of a program that might enable your country to survive a downturn more effectively. This is called wind tunneling, when you're looking at how effective your policies will be in different environments, especially with things like climate change and adaptation or mitigation, judging how effective investing in different forms of agricultural responses or seawalls are. Testing those kind of responses under different scenarios is quite a good way of strengthening your policy insight. And finally, the fifth point is around building an adaptive approach to implementing and monitoring, and a risk-friendly approach to evaluation. Now, what this means is that if we are in an environment where we can't really predict what's going to happen and what the right thing is to do, but we need to sense and probe, this has two very fundamental implications for monitoring and evaluation. First of all, it means that you need to kind of try things out a little bit and then build on successes and failures. And you need the resources to be able to do so. In addition, it also means that we need to kind of monitor assumptions and assumptions behind our plan and test, seek early indications of if our country and the assumptions behind our plan are going in a different direction. So a big difference in an emergent strategic planning approach is that this monitoring and evaluation becomes real-time and it becomes future-focused rather than just looking at what's happened in the past according to some fixed indicators that never change. And I would say that the really interesting question is how to build and what is it that you can do in your organizations, in your teams, to actually create the incentives for doing that. So is there a learning and development budget to ensure that people do actually test and try and innovate? Are people rewarded? Are leaders rewarding different types of alternatives? So that's the next slide, please. Slide 12. I've written a paper here that I'm just highlighting about what this looks like for government. So this process of doing emergent strategic planning and merging it with action is called system stewardship. And it basically involves getting governments to move away from policy making and policy implementation from a command and control way to actually being an enabler and a network of others to do so. So you see civil servants as a custodian of the process. So if you're interested in that, download it from the GCPSE website. So moving on to slide 13, let's now talk about the growing interest and demand for futures, how we see it internationally and nationally. The SDG process has modeled some of these desirable attributes of emergent policy-making process under complex conditions. The World We Want process very much examined the future in a participative way, engaging with 9 million people over 3 years. And interestingly enough, a lot of the insights and feedback were around this issue around governance, and it has shown the potential of participative dialogues about the futures as a powerful tool to inspire narrative and a vision for all. So this is something that we can replicate, an ambition to achieve at the national level. Now, some countries already have this happening, and very, very sophisticated processes too. Some have them happening, but not really in a way that's participative enough, and some countries don't have them at all. There are other indicators of emergent strategic planning processes being used at the international level. You've got the open working group that consciously modeled a complex systems approach. That's the quote on the top right-hand corner. And then you've got some really interesting statements by the World Economic Forum in their kind of research on governance, as well as on the Oxford Martin Commission. stating the importance of mechanisms globally and nationally for actually engaging and making decisions on the future. Next slide. At the national level, and I've only selected a few examples here, you've got some new innovations that we can really learn from. Malaysia over the past 6 years has set up a whole ecosystem, almost infrastructure of organizations at the center using innovative and participative approaches over the longer term to influence decision-making around infrastructure, health, education, etc. You've also got Finland, who is a very interesting example of how the Parliament can play a real role in actually encouraging, because they're effectively the custodians of the government beyond the term of the election, beyond the executive. So Finland's Parliamentary Committee for the Future is one that consults with Finnish people and then brings out a report at the time of the election saying this is what the Finnish people are concerned about and interested in over the next 20 years. You've got South Africa that has also been using futures approach since the Montenegro scenarios in 1991 onwards, and they have quite an interesting government structure, but also one that reflects how the pendulum swings in this area, that sometimes institutions are set up and then shut down again. And then Niti Aayog, which was a very interesting example on a visit to the excellent UN mission in India, where the Indian Commission of Planning has actually been closed down, and it's being replaced by a new organization, Niti Aayog, that is explicitly trying to use more of these kind of participative, less traditional top-down, different approaches, and in particular trying to push a lot of the decision-making and conversations about the future down to the state level. That's a very interesting development, and also an opportunity to shape their thinking. So my polling question to you now at this point, and I'll carry on talking afterwards, but be very interested in collecting this afterwards, is given the number of countries on the line, is what are the interesting innovations that are happening around emergent strategic planning in your country, in particular around either the centre, around the Prime Minister's offices, or potentially around the Ministry of Finance, or very much at the state or local level. If there are interesting examples that you'd like to highlight, then we would be very interested in hearing about them. There are other innovations, of course, and this is slide, I think.
Unmuted.
Perhaps so. I hope I'm not getting my maths wrong. There are very interesting innovations that are going on. So there's new government units, structures, councils, ombudsmen of future generations, for example, that are being established in countries of very different types. LDCs, OECD countries, landlocked, small island states. There is a lot of innovation happening, and we can really learn from them. There's, for example, Ombudsman for Future Generations, the kind of youth-led movement to getting one at a global level is also, there's also campaigns at a national level in many countries. There's in Sweden, there's a Minister for the Future, and there's a very active insight and community of NGOs out there that are increasingly interested in the space. And I encourage you to use the hashtag #BondFutures. They had a discussion on futures and development last week, and you will see from some of the civil society organizations participating who are particularly active in this field. There's also evidence and growing use of foresight processes and capacity building and visions by regional bodies and international institutions. For example, ECLAC, ASEAN, but actually Africa Union, the Agenda 2063, etc. And there's also an interesting South-South collaboration aspect to this, both on projects but also in sharing capability building across governments. So especially Asia, like Singapore, Malaysia, and South Korea, are very much reaching out to Gulf, African, Latin American countries and regional institutions on this agenda. And there's a growth in leadership of international networks on Foresight. So, for example, the Global Futures Network was hosted by India this year and will be by China next year. And the UN is driving some of this innovation, and it's through this planning process that we could do so much more and tap into. I think this is the real key for UN country teams, is no need to reinvent the wheel. Often there's interesting material out there that can just be brought together, curated by yourselves. You've got those relationships with those international networks and institutions and bring the information together. Okay. So now we will talk, if I have the time, and I'll go back to Gina. I've got 3 more slides to talk about, but I could spend quite a lot of time talking about the case studies. I can now talk about the Laos example and then perhaps the Rwanda one quickly, because I know that Anna is on the line, and so she can very effectively cover the excellent Montenegro case study. So this is now slide 17. So in Laos, what they did was actually pull together with Futurescaper, which is a cloud-based intelligence gathering mechanism for basically surveying people and finding out what they think about the future. They basically used that to engage the UN country team, their development partners, civil society, government, and the public at large to explore the issues facing Laos, what development concerns people had on their minds, and also building the scenarios around them for the Laos development report out to 2021. So the project was launched earlier in 2015, has got input from a lot of UN and also other participants, and it was effectively, in particular, because it was part of a broader project to, and there were small grants, to effectively commission civil society organizational research on vulnerable groups and also to do wider consultations. But what was particularly interesting was that common insights, they were able to engage with people who were not normally at all part of the process, and they raised very high concerns around corruption, political will, and governance. In those circumstances, it was a challenge to sensitively communicate those responses back to the government, but at least it enabled these issues to go on the table. So their conclusions was that this is extremely effective, especially with engaging non-traditional participants in a strategic planning process, especially ethnic minorities they found was important, and the use of innovative tools was very effective. But the dissemination was an implementation challenge because of the incentives to participate weren't always there, and though the government was very supportive, sometimes very practical things caused an issue. So, for example, a letter was sent out to people with the link to click through it, but of course it didn't go out in email form, so it was very difficult for people to use that piece of paper to participate. Another insight was that it was really important to engage with new and interesting stakeholders rather than following a predefined process. So having the flexibility to design your process according to your needs is a very important insight. And basically, having had the money to do it up front has basically meant that they can streamline a lot of their outreach, and they've ended up being very efficient and driving efficiencies as a result. And a key success factor was the capacity within the resident coordinator's office to lead the activity and drive the interagency efforts. The Rwanda case study basically was in response to the government who asked the UN team for technical support on Foresight to support an innovative public policy development around thinking about urban planning. So they organized then, and it was all senior policy people that participated, And it really demonstrated the concept and tools of strategic foresight and its value on the process of urban and rural planning. So the President's Office provided very good support, and the government ended up making commitments as a result of the workshop that they've already implemented. One of them was around using this in other cities outside of Kigali, and to start an innovation fund to spur this kind of activity around cross-governmental working around collective planning. And this was included in the recent annual budget. But the key insights from that was the importance of being able to respond and have the flexibility to respond to government requests. It was very valuable, they thought, the UN country team, a very valuable way of demonstrating UN added value. So supporting the priorities in the government in a more innovative and less traditional way by using it to support government good practice. But the resources were needed to respond quickly, and so that requires the ability to respond quickly with resources. Associated with that is the importance and the insight that innovation has to be treated as a process, not a one-off event. So often by doing this kind of thing, there is appetite that is generated, and how do you see that as an ongoing process rather than a one-off intervention? And of course, the key insight that government partnership and buy-in makes all the difference in terms of impact. I will skip over the Montenegro and Wales example, though I do encourage you to look at the example of Wales, because they've used the SDG process to set up a legal duty, an obligation in their legal framework upon public servants to take future generations into account when they're making policy decisions. This is a very interesting development, a bit like the Bolivian example of giving Mother Earth constitutional rights, so people can actually sue on her behalf in the courts. And it's an example of the kind of different innovations that's happening internationally. So, here are 4 ways.
Do you want me to give the floor to Anna in Montenegro while we're on?
That would be an excellent idea.
Okay, let me see if I can do that. Anna, are you there?
Yes, I am. Hi, thank you, Gina. Thank you, Catherine. Can you hear me?
Perfectly.
Yes, great. I'm here with my colleague from now, she's in UNICEF, Maria Novkovic. She used to work for UNDP, and we worked together on, let's say, introducing Foresight in Montenegro. And if we can say, it was very interesting exercise for us who were involved, and we also think for users, let's say for partners who were involved, and for citizens and everybody else. And we are now using the Foresight for planning of the new strategy on youth, because we involved youth also in development of UNDAF, and they found the Foresight exercise is very much useful, interesting, and they're also planning to use it in their own, let's say, NGO work, which some of them do. So without further ado, I just would briefly go over and say, after hearing what Kat said, we can say that we used open engagement. Let's say we had we did the open engagement of a wide set of views. We did co-creation together with people, together with non-traditional stakeholders, and then we, together with them, we identified alternative futures, let's say worst-case scenarios, preferred future, and everything else. And we did it in the context of UNDAF. So we asked people in both offline and online engagement how they see the future of Montenegro, let's say how they see the future of 2021 and the future of 2030, what they would like to be, what would be their preferred future, and what they foresee as the most probable future. So in these offline workshops, we engaged vulnerable youth, then experts from academia, then representatives of NGOs, NGOs representing people with disabilities, LGBT, then employment, student associations, so on and so forth. And we played this Foresight game, which we called Enhanced Survey Tool. We had to call it like that. It's not very, very interesting as the name game, because we used the same tool, but it was iterated. Let's say after the game with the with these people whom I just mentioned. So we use the same tool and the same game for the workshop with the government. This is why we had to give it, let's say, a serious name. So we are taken seriously by the government, and we were. But let me go back to this workshop. So we engaged all these people, and we played the game on the futures of 2021 and 2030, and how they see the UN's involvement in that, who would be the main stakeholders, you know, what would be the main challenges, how to do, what could be the UN's response, and so on. And then we also engaged citizens in an online Foresight game, which we developed for this purpose, where they had to identify different SDG issues, and also this preferred future and probable future. And then, let's say, within first 4 days, there were some 700 people who logged onto the online game, and so we thought that they find it very interesting, because 700 people in 4 days, it's a lot, you know. And we use social media to promote, let's say, their involvement, to instigate their involvement. Then we used Foresight and backcasting, so going backwards. Let's say you predict the future, and then you go backwards and see what you need in order to achieve that certain future. So we used both Foresight and backcasting in the strategic planning meeting with the government and national institutions. We had also Parliament there and Ombudsperson's office. And all of these insights, which we got from the offline, online engagement with all these non-traditional stakeholders, and then with partners and national institutions. So all of that contributed, all of these outcomes of these sessions were then relayed to senior decision makers during the SPR, and they were also later captured in planning documents. So everything we did previous to the SPR was used to create the Foresight exercise, which we used during the SPR, you know, for the game with the government. And then we also, they helped get us, let's say, unique citizens' insights. And as I said before, from non-traditional, you know, people who are not traditionally involved in development of UNDAF. And it also enriched the content of UNDAF. So if we would have to choose how Foresight helped us, we would say that it helped us engage different non-traditional stakeholders, and the engagement was very innovative and useful, and they really liked it, all people who took part in it. And then because we engaged them in something, we have to admit that developing UNDAF is not very interesting to everybody, you know, who takes part in that. So we used Foresight to enrich the process, to make it more meaningful and more interesting, and I think we succeeded. And also everything that was used in this exercise was later on, let's say, was used when developing the UNDAF document, and was also used in discussions which followed later on with different results groups and the government. So this would be in brief how we, let's say, the process, who we engaged, and how the Foresight helped us in the strategic planning of the UNDAF. Any questions? I'm going to ask Maria if she wants to add anything.
Hello, everyone. Maybe just to add my 2 cents, since we did roll out this serious game and it had a few sessions with different audiences, it would possibly be interesting for us to repeat the same process a few years down the line, just to see whether people are still singling out the same issues. If not, that would mean that we are on the right track with our UNDAF, and if they indeed still raise the same concerns as they did nowadays, it would probably mean that we are not making significant strides. Another point about the relationship between online and offline engagement, of course, there is much to be said about the ability of Internet to reach vast arrays of people and everyone who cannot fit into a room, and that is true. But in our case, because the methodology that we used was new for everyone, and there was also a significant learning curve, we saw that we could get more good quality insights from people if we had them in a room, whereas for a more robust internet consultation stage, probably we would have needed more time or more instructive sessions to make it even more productive. But for us, in the process that we conducted, it was useful to apply this method of thinking about the future more critically and with more analytical views, because in the end it did enrich the content of UNDAF. Nowadays it would be interesting to see how we can use or borrow the same concepts maybe potentially down the line in monitoring of UNDAF as we go along.
Over to you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Maria and Anna. This is really useful, and I think it answers a lot of the questions which are coming in over the chat box on, talking as much about the how as the what. So really interesting and a really important point, I think, about using serious games even to engage government. I know here sometimes when people hear gamification or games, they sort of cringe because they don't know what that means, and it does seem sort of illegitimate. So it's interesting to hear your experience on that it did go well once you gave it a different name. And also, also Maria's point, thank you for that, on repeating the consultative processes as part of the monitoring mechanism, sort of for the annual review of the UNDAF as a strategic plan. So huge thanks for that. Let's then go back to Kat so we can close out the presentation end, and then we'll open up for questions and answers for the last 15 minutes or so.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. And thanks, Anna and Maria, for a brilliant summary of what was a really interesting example of how Foresight can get some really interesting results. Another thing that I very much liked about their case study is you basically design according to what you can do, what's feasible. And so if it's a combination of online and offline, if you've got a certain budget constraint, if you've got a time constraint, the whole point is that these tools are at your disposal depending on the constraints that you face. So just use them to provide insights rather than think that there's a fixed process that always needs to be followed. So that takes me on actually to the slide, I think it's slide 18, called 4 ways that Foresight or futures-based exercises can help UN country team efforts. What was very much identified by within Rwanda is that this can really help governments develop a technical skill that they value and ask for. And this is seen increasingly by governments around the world, and I know that GCPSE, based in Singapore, do an excellent job of actually responding to that, to going in and helping build capability. And very much the conversations around SDG 16 and implementing SDG 16 as we're moving into the SDG implementation, I think is also an opportunity to have conversations around this and develop an opportunity to develop a specific UN country team offer to the governments that I don't think many other development actors can actually provide at all. The second way is actually, as involved in Laos or Montenegro, is using this in the UNDAF process, either deep dive on an issue or looking comprehensively across a wider set of issues with different types of participants to explore the interlinkages. So you could do something on SDG 6, for example, and then explore the different SDGs that are linked into it and the different networks and ecosystems in order to kind of drive and coordinate transformative ideas and responses by getting different, private sector, different communities into the room. And also it's interesting to think that perhaps some of this stuff could be done and have discussions regionally, either, for example, looking at impacts of climate change regionally or looking at views of youth, etc. So there's 2 external ways that Foresight activities within the UNDAF process can really help the relationship with governments. But there's also some really interesting ways that it can be used internally within the country team in a more ad hoc way, effectively, not necessarily as part of the UNDAF, but really to kind of drive internal efficiencies in sharing resources, helping prioritization, perhaps if there's any kind of risk plans that need to be developed collaboratively, and sense check whether there's gaps that have been missed. So you can use these as tools to see whether there's anything that you should be doing that you're not doing, perhaps forming the basis of a common vision. So you can use these tools in a singular way as well as part of a wider process. And there's really interesting agencies, UN agencies that do this really well. So a lot around UNICEF and UNAID, they do them, use it very effectively in that way. So you don't need to go all in necessarily. And then finally, this is something that very much came out from a lot of the conversations that I've had, is around you can use it to lead an internal conversation about the role of the UN in country. So various interviewees that I spoke to really discussed the importance of developing an UNDAF that is commensurate with the resources that the UN can hope to lever, and that the changing ecosystem of development actors and resources, and therefore possibly the changing role of the UN, could mean that foresight exercises could basically help different parts of the UNCT explore what its offer is in 5, 10, 15 years' time. So, polling question for you very quickly. Of those 4, are there any particular opportunities in your country team, any open doors that you'd like to push against? And then finally, I'll leave you with the last slide, which is around some 4 takeaways. On the country analysis process, using platforms and a bit like Montenegro and Laos, that encourage outreach both online and in person, and see this as an ongoing resource to tap into for monitoring and evaluation using micro-narratives as well as targets. That the country analysis should also include a future trends process, and also have a stage that explicitly builds scenarios and a possible vision. The third takeaway is around that the strategic prioritization exercise in the UNDAF process should be based on a gap analysis, not just of the current situation, but what the future trends and scenarios. And that monitoring includes strategic navigation and risk management and monitoring of the assumptions and the strategic shocks and potential shocks, not just of operational risk. And finally, 4 insights, I think, and tips on the how to do this. Keeping it simple, experiment and over-deliver rather than taking a big, over-designing a complicated process. You can iterate and go back to it over time. So keeping it simple is important. The impact and what you're trying to achieve must be at the center of any foresight process. So the design of the process, and this gets to the how question, really depends on the context that you're in. Where you are in the cycle, what the UN country team looks like and how many different agencies there are, the context, the relationship of the country team with the government, and the culture. So having a design that reflects all of these issues are really important. Finally, resources, training and development guidance is needed to support this process, but you don't need expensive external consultants. Frugal foresight is absolutely possible, and sharing the experiences that the different country teams have and building on other insights and material is absolutely the way forward. And finally, it's really important to communicate the insights and the value of having done this process. Looking at the counterfactuals, getting people to give you narratives and stories about how it's made a difference is really important to capture straight away, because when you look back, you can easily take it for granted the insights that you got. So capturing those insights and communicating the value and sharing your insights and of good practice across the network is very important. And that is me finished. So back to you, Gina.
Thank you so much. It's good to end on the note of communication. We're getting a lot of questions in the chat box on more documentation of case studies. And let me just take that opportunity to plug the UNDG blog, silofighters.org, where certainly so far Montenegro has written 2 different blogs about their experience with Foresight, so it's really worth checking that. It's short content with a lot of hyperlinks if you want to read more. And also, Kat has written a paper for us reflecting on that. So if you're interested in receiving that paper, just send us an email at, I'll send the email in the chat box actually, rather than spelling it out now. So let's go to questions then that are coming through on the line. First, and here I'd be interested if Anna and Maria, if you are also willing to weigh in. It's really great to have your perspective as real live people working at the UN at the country level who've used these kinds of methods is extremely useful. So so the first question comes from Zarar in Pakistan. So there are two questions actually. One is, how do we convince our UN partners to take this kind of emergent strategic planning approach or use of foresight? And linked to that, what would be the response of the donor community to these kinds of approaches? So how do we convince our UN partners, and what would be the response of the donors if we use this kind of approach? So we'll open that up to Kat, Maria, and Anna.
Maybe we can give based on our experience in Montenegro, if you allow.
Absolutely.
So how? First, we, as the UN country team, agreed to do it, and then we used it in UNDAF. So we used this way to introduce it also to the government, to our different partners in civil society. At the beginning, they were kind of, at the beginning, very puzzled. But then when we introduced what the Foresight was, and when we actually built all the exercises on the results of post-2015 national consultations, you know, then they understood it, you know, and then we built the story together of both preferred and likely futures. And we also, in our strategic prioritization retreat, where we used Foresight and backcasting, we had development partners, and they were really open to that, you know. They were really, you know, they took part in the exercises, you know. So I would say that you introduce it in an UN, let's say, exercise such as UNDAF for development of a certain strategy to involve vulnerable groups, to involve youth, to involve non-traditional partners and stakeholders. And once they take it on board, and they will, believe me, then you can. It's also easier to introduce and to present it to the government and to development partners. And I think when it comes to development partners, they're very much open to it, to any innovation. Maria?
And there was a quote that we used in our UNDAF Design Innovation Facility proposal, and that spoke about people's inability to think about the future. So this was our first line in any conversation, and it was very easy to convince everyone that we humans are incapable of imagining different parallel, alternative, or even unwanted futures. But just giving a few examples and talking about the unprecedented level of changes that the world is going through, mentioning climate change and the rise of different radicalist movements, global threat of terrorism, those kinds of big ticket items that we consume through the news, but don't really understand the pace of changes. So bringing to the fore these kinds of examples and explaining that what we know about strategic planning is largely influenced by the past, and we feel confident and competent talking about the past. But when we talk about the future, what we can envisage is maybe a year ahead, a year and a half along the way, but we really are incapable of thinking critically about the future. And once we convinced everyone that this is true and they agreed, it was easier for us to take this approach and build it into the UNDAF rollout. In essence, we had a process that had to be done. All of the UNDAF roadmap stages were mandatory. We just enriched all of these stages with new methodologies that ultimately provided us alternative insights. So it was essentially started with an honest discussion about our incapability to design plans for the future.
Excellent, thank you.
I'd like to build on exactly those points, which is actually the answer to that for both engagement with UN partners and development partners is it really depends. What you'll find is you'll find early adopters in all circumstances, in organizations, some people that really get it and like experimenting and very much see the links to the work that they're doing already, because there are lots of work links to ideas like policy labs, innovation labs, etc., digital service, open government, the links to the open government partnerships, etc. So some people get it and are innovating, some people are less up for it, and then it's about having a clear script, I think, which would be a very helpful resource for all country teams to have to make the case for it in terms of it's useful because of efficiencies, it drives efficiencies and prioritizations, it kind of also helps overcome conflict as well. But I would like to kind of pick up on one of the points around the UN agencies, which is, this is actually quite, I've done this this is also very helpful for not just for UN country teams, but actually I do this work for diplomatic embassies, high commissions abroad, and it's not an unsimilar situation where you've got different ministries out in the embassy and they have different budgets and they have different guidance from the centre. And what I've found in practice, having gone to various embassies around the world, is that actually talking about future 5-10 years out actually takes away a lot of some of the problems around interagency challenges and conflict around short-term budgets. So I've actually found Foresight to be a very, very effective tool at overcoming some of the administrative challenges and barriers between different agencies or ministries or departments and so on. And there's an interesting book on that generally about how Foresight can help overcome issues around conflict, which is Transformative Scenario Planning by Adam Kahane, where he looks at the application of this as well to more conflict-prone areas as well.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Maybe just a word on what we found in convincing others to take on innovative approach. If you focus on what problem you're solving rather than the fact that there's this new method you've heard of, we find this to be a much more useful way to get people on board, because everyone's trying to solve problems. Not everyone is interested in doing things in new ways. And just a comment on that from Dafir Hassan, who's working in UNDP Iraq. He says, I've been working on developing projects addressing innovation, targeting young people in Iraq. My main problem was internal rather than external. My painful experience makes me wonder if in the UN is ready to be a leading position to introduce innovation. He says that country offices should be monitored and evaluated in this regard. So just some food for thought there. I want to go to a question from Heike Alefson, who is from the Resident Coordinator Office in Thailand. This is for Kat, and then Anna and Maria, if you used human rights issues, please feel free to jump in. Heike's question is, you mentioned that one can apply Foresight to human rights scenarios. Could you elaborate, please? Thanks.
Ooh. Well, that's a great question. There's different ways, I guess, that you could look at it from a human rights perspective. You can either look at what some of the drivers of the future circumstances in the scenario are, to look at what might actually be changing in the future that gives you opportunities or perhaps creating more problems depending on how the rights violations are happening. For example, if you're looking at certain issues around gender-based rights or issues around conflict, what's really important and to get into is how you think that perhaps attitudes or values and beliefs may shift over the next 5 to 10 to 15 years, because that often gives opportunities for advocacy and intervention that need to be planned for early on. But then there's the other aspect around the real value of Foresight in addressing conflict issues, and how you can basically move beyond entrenched positions, both in terms of the problems of the here and the now, and also arguments over what the right policy responses are, by having conversations about the future. So the Mont scenario examples in South Africa is an excellent example of that, and I'd encourage you to read. I can send a link on that, but also examples of scenario approaches in both, let's say, Venezuela and Israel-Palestine. And finally, depending on kind of how you want to kind of interpret human rights, sometimes futures approaches and studies can be really useful when you're deep diving on a particular policy issue as well. So, for example, the Organization of American States came out with a changed position on really encouraging OECD countries to basically legalize drugs. That's got obviously a huge human rights component aspect to it, but it was very much driven by a foresight exercise that was done at the OAS level behind the scenes. So I personally think that if you want transformative, different policy ideas on the table in a really entrenched, problematic set of issues, which is either conflict or crime or gender or drugs, for example, foresight is actually quite a powerful tool for bringing people, very different people, around the table and actually exploring and getting to new insights.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Anna Maria, did you guys want to come in on this?
No, we don't have anything else to add.
Okay.
Sorry.
No worries. All right, so let's go then to the last question before we hand back to our panel. Let me just, apologies, let me correct my introduction of Heike Alefsen. She is the regional UNDG advisor for human rights for Asia Pacific. She works with countries across the region in developing their UNDAFs and mainstreaming human rights. So my apologies for guessing wrongly that she was based at the national level in Thailand. We'll take the last question then before we hand back over to Kat, Maria, and Anna for final closing words of advice on taking this forward. So our final question is from Radhika Kaulbatra in India, Kat, who I think you've met when you were there. She says, would also be interested in connecting with countries that are developing SDG frameworks, especially those using the preferred and probable future approach for planning. So just to put that out there for you all to see if it strikes any reaction or sparks any ideas.
Do you want me to come in on this and then make my closing remarks as well? Would that help?
Yeah, that'd be great.
Okay. Hello, Radhika. It was lovely to meet you and your excellent team when I was in New Delhi, and it's exactly these kind of opportunities with Niti Aayog, the Changing Planning Commission in India, that means that 2016 and those of you who are designing your UNDAF processes now, it's a really interesting confluence of opportunities and I guess, and also where the opportunity is for the UN to kind of, and I think the one thing that I forgot to say in my earlier response to you about development partners, this is actually something that other development partners expect the UN to do. So it feels from the interviews that I had with, I had interviews with UN country teams, with UN agencies, and then about 15 development actors outside the UN. And this is actually a role, this kind of convening and having conversations about the future, especially around up to 2030 and beyond, is a space that I think that the UN can legitimately claim, and as these, and bringing conversations around bringing the SDGs down to a national level, but making sure that the tail doesn't wag the dog. So how does that fusion with the domestic planning process work, so it's still owned by national governments, and that it builds their capacity, and how efforts at the UN country team level are aimed at supporting them and having and encouraging governments to have very broad conversations with their own constituencies about what they want the future to look like, so they're then participating. That, I think, is the key. And it's not going to be done in a technocratic way to kind of compare the Planning Commission 16.1 to the SDGs list 7.5, for example. This is a kind of strategic and political process, I think, that the UN country team really needs to take forward, and it's not just simply about mapping. So having much stronger conversations about what that looks like in practice, how it fits into the monitoring and evaluation processes, the conversations about indicators, and also the means of implementation and monitoring together with civil society input. This is the critical issue facing us, and it's not just at UN country team level, it's at parts of, all the UN needs to come together to discuss this. So yes, brilliant question, Radhika, thank you very much. And then I just wanted to make a final point, which is, I think, in response to the excellent point made by the gentleman from Iraq, where I think the way that you frame, and also your comment, Gina, about, you don't need to call this, you don't take the Foresight stick and hit people with it, although I fear this is what I may have been doing over the past hour, but you signed up for it, so I feel less guilty. I think this is about making better decisions. This is about, enhancing effectiveness. People will have different frameworks within which they'll be more recipients to your message. So, it's not about saying this is Foresight and this is the kind of cookie cutter process that you always follow to do that, because that's the quickest way for investing lots of people's time and energy and for them to lose buy-in and interest. So, really take what you're trying to do and take it to the decision and the decision maker and use their language that they're interested in and show early results. That's the number one key takeaway I'd like you to take, I guess, from this session, is do something quickly and show the value and show the results. Use the language that they want you to use, if that means that you can go and get buy-in in a quicker way. But the thing that will speak to you is people being in the room and getting insights that they wouldn't have normally got, and then capture that and make sure that other people hear that the Minister of Finance really kind of got an amazing insight from this session in a way that he wouldn't have from another session. And then that's how you kind of slowly build up momentum. And that's me over and out. And I just want to say huge thanks to all of you for listening, and especially to Gina and her team for actually convening this meeting.
Thank you, Kat. Anna, Maria, do you guys have any closing words?
Just briefly, what we learned is that people want to be involved, in decision-making in all the planning processes that have to do with their future. So I would definitely, let's say, encourage other countries to engage citizens more through Foresight or some other innovative method. Let's say for us in Montenegro, Foresight maybe use of Foresight was enabled and was easy because we have a long track of using different innovative methods of planning and involving citizens on board, especially through some UN agencies such as UNICEF and UNDP. So for us, we already have prepared the terrain, let's say, in the last 3-4 years. But definitely I would say also from what we learned from post-2015, people want to be engaged, so do use Foresight or any other tool to engage citizens. And then what we're planning to do now is we're looking at what also Maria mentioned earlier, ways to find the ways and see how we can continue this in the implementation phase of UNDAF and also in monitoring and evaluation, and possibly if we can somehow, using this Foresight or what we learned in this first phase, whether we can now in the second phase maybe use it to roll out its UNDAF, to communicate it to other, to the same people who were involved, and also to create a national pool of, let's say, SDG advocates and champions with whom we could work on implementation of the SDG agenda. So these are some of just of our thoughts, and also maybe food for thought for other countries listening. By using Foresight or any other, even design thinking, any other innovative tool for strategic planning. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you guys so much. So let's just close out by saying huge thanks to our presenters, especially Katerina Tully, who's really given some thought to our own internal UN planning processes on how to open them up and make them more future oriented. We're hugely thankful for all the perspectives you've given and all the time you've given us today. Thank you also to Ana Dautovic in the Resident Coordinator's Office in Montenegro, and Maria Novkovic, who's now with UNICEF Montenegro. It's great to hear the firsthand experiences. I think we have a fantastic webinar. This will be recorded, so we'll send you the recording. We'll send you also Kat's paper that she's done for us, and keep the dialogue going. Always happy to hear reflections via webinars or on the UNDG blog, silofighters.org. Thank you so much, everyone. Over and out.